So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to San Francisco Zen Center. I'm not sure, this keeps moving around, so let me know, sound people, if anything happens with it. My name is Kyoshin Wendy Lewis, and today I'll be addressing the interwoven themes of community and ethics. This afternoon, there will be a jukai initiation in which a group of Zen students who are here today will receive the precepts or the ethical guidelines of Buddhism and Zen. This ceremony is a wonderful celebration of commitment to a life of Zen practice and reflection. And it's also a statement of community or sangha values. I just wanted to say that, considering that the news is full of even more violence and massacre, I thought perhaps it would be okay for me to be a bit gloomy today, while also honoring this afternoon's ceremony, because they're interrelated, these ways that we make commitments and ethical promises to ourselves and others. It's all related. This funny thing. Well, it's kind of twisted in the other way, so. No, it's better the way you just had it. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Maybe if I go like that. Yep. Okay. Oh, yeah, that sounds better. Sorry. Thanks. So, community, word we sort of throw around here and there, it implies both inclusion, my community, and exclusion. Those who, for whatever reason, are not part of what we consider community. This is not judgmental, it's just like, this is how we work with these kind of concepts. And of course, our cultural and personal assumptions play a part in defining what we consider to be community and what it includes and excludes, both positive and complex. And in a spiritual context, and in an institution like this that promotes and is established on the basis of the Bodhisattva ideal, this can be very complex and ambiguous, as well as joyful and marked by deep friendship. So, Michael gave the Dharma talk last week about Martin Luther King, and I was thinking about his legacy and how we absorb it and use it to talk about various things. So the holiday for Martin Luther King that, celebrates him was this past Monday, and then February is Black History Month. And that is described. Every February, the U.S. honors the contributions and sacrifices of African Americans who have helped shape the nation. Black History Month celebrates the rich cultural heritage, triumphs, and adversities that are an indelible part of our country's history. And of course, as I've mentioned before, and you all know, there are similar months that celebrate, for instance, women's history, Asian American and Pacific Islanders heritage, Jewish American heritage, and gay pride. And these are acknowledgments of both recognition and of difference, of kind of human community and identity community. So when we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday and give that Dharma talk, which was given with great grace and respect by Michael, also I reflect on how many Buddhists have sort of appropriated King as a bodhisattva ideal based on his advocacy of nonviolence. And part of that is true respect and appreciation. And another part, I think, is based in a form of fear. You know, considering the historical and current level of racist violence that's perpetuated in action, thought, and words by those referred to as white, upon those referred to as black, it's logical to expect a response of resentment and retaliation. Whoop. We're having a little comedy with this thing. Okay. I actually was telling my sister when I meet a person of color on the street or on a bus or something like that, and it feels like there some distaste I experience from them, I think, phew, I'm taking in some of that karma. It's okay. I appreciate it. So it's logical to expect it. And at the same time, King's intention was to kind of circumvent the exchange of violence and hatred for violence and hatred, which is often the response in so many historical, including at the moment, circumstances. His advocacy of nonviolence was, as opposed to more militant anti-racism, I think offers people a sense of safety and control. Like, oh, it's nonviolent, so I don't really have to, worry in a certain way. And it also alleviates the fear of conflict that maintaining the status quo requires. And this can also often be the case in Buddhist communities, that fear of conflict. So we appropriate this idea of nonviolence, and then it becomes a reason to not go there. So when I was in college in the 1970s, early 1970s at Lone Mountain, which is in San Francisco, it's now part of the University of San Francisco, but there was an unusual meeting. And these kind of meetings sort of popped up here and there, but there it was at my college. So what it was Jean Genet was in town. He's a French writer and radical political activist. David Hilliard and another member of the Black Panther Party were meeting to discuss justice and political action. And the female French professor of Lone Mountain, she was like the only woman's voice, pretty much the whole thing, was the translator for Jean Genet. So it was this very interesting combination of realities. But it was in this large meeting space, and it was really crowded, and a lot of us had to stand up. And the discussion was really intense. Here was this person from France, and the Black Panthers at that time were very active, and actually a group that I used to meet with met in the same building that they did. And it was so we'd like meet in the halls and say hello and everything, and yet all this other stuff was going on. It was very strange or complex. I don't know exactly how to describe it. But I remember feeling this sort of combination of emotions and thoughts, uncertainty, and grief, and this sense of the dignity and sort of carefully articulated thoughts and ideas from David Hilliard and his colleague. And there were comments made during the discussion about violence and activism, and the Black Panthers said that responding to the accepted murder of blacks in American culture the response included violence towards the representatives of that culture. And then during the question and answer at the end, a young white man stood up and asked, well, would you kill white people who are supporting your protest and demand for justice? And David Hilliard sort of paused and he said, yes. And I thought, it's like we think we get these little certificates of goodness that protect us. And this isn't judgmental. It's just like, how do we negotiate all this? And I sort of was a little relieved that he had responded to the man in that way. And then there was that sense, that perplexity, and this sense of ambivalence about how justice can be addressed. Because certainly it's not exactly working. I mean, things change, there's movement, there's adjustment, but nonviolence hasn't really worked, but it can also ameliorate fear and defensiveness. Often those who choose nonviolent way of addressing these issues sort of get mowed over or silenced, and then they become martyrs, and then it goes on. And yet, for the very sake of our humanity, I think nonviolence needs to be kept as an ideology or hope, regarding this repetitive tendency to address our disagreements and arguments over power and ownership through silencing and murder. And violence itself can bring attention to injustice, fear, and defensiveness. But it doesn't really work either. So in my experience of the women's movement, I considered my anger and sense of disempowerment in the balance of my inheritance from my male ancestors and my love for particular men, historical figures, as well as family and friends and lovers. And it didn't resolve my anger, but keeping it in mind offered this kind of compass and resource for self-examination. So my anger was justified and useful and unsafe to really express, usually. But then how does one find, freedom in the midst of these historically entrenched cultural assumptions and so on? And who's in charge of maintaining those assumptions? And these are not new or profound questions, yet I think they can take on energy and a wider perspective in the context of community and ethics. We can take them in more deeply and less defensively. To me, studying ethics, as in taking the precepts, is a process of being taken apart and put back together again and again and again. One of the things the precepts remind us is to ask how we know when we are keeping them and when we are not. Mistakes were made, but not by me, why we justify foolish beliefs, bad decisions, and hurtful acts, Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson examine the resistance most of us have to looking at our personal and general complicity in mistakes of judgment, understanding, equity, and awareness, and our cognitive and emotional resistance to considering how that might be addressed openly, and through what Buddhist practice describes as repentance. And that's also part of the initiation ceremony. The engine that drives self-justification, the energy that produces the need to justify our actions and decisions, especially the wrong ones, is an unpleasant feeling called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a state of tension that occurs when a person holds two cognitions, ideas, attitudes, beliefs, or opinions, that are psychologically inconsistent. Just as a side thing, I've been pondering for a while the combination of animal rights, vegetarianism, and veganism in terms of the pet food industry. And this cognitive dissonance that doesn't seem to be addressed in concerns with animal rights, like, well, if we're not supposed to eat meat, how does the whole pet food industry work in terms of providing meat for our pets? And that process has a huge ecological impact. So where do we stand? What do we choose? Somebody, I was reading a review of 2 books about animal rights, and one of the authors said cats should be kept indoors. I guess so they don't kill birds. But then what do they eat? They eat other animals, and that has to be processed and packaged and everything. And so this little odd dissonance about exactly what we value and what our preferences are. We want our pets, and we talk about rescue pets. So I'm still working on it, but I think that that's the kind of dissonance that is uncomfortable and just deeply goes into some of these things. Perhaps the greatest lesson of dissonance theory is that we can't wait around for people to have moral conversions, sudden changes of heart, or new insights. Most human beings and institutions are going to do everything in their power to reduce dissonance in ways that are favorable to them, that allow them to justify their mistakes and maintain business as usual. Understanding how the mind yearns for consonance and rejects information that questions our beliefs, decisions, or preferences teaches us to be open to the possibility of error. It also helps us to let go of the need to be right. So we're always going into some sort of a circle. And I think one tendency in this circular thing, is that we keep reiterating intentions without actually offering evidence of them being fulfilled. So it makes us feel good to say we believe in something being right that's of benefit to others, but we don't actually do anything significant or change anything significant. And I think this sometimes takes the form of expressing ideologies such as bodhisattvahood without quite including adjustment and sacrifice and generosity. And that's not a criticism, because just what is it we can do? And what form does it take? And if we overdo adjustment and sacrifice and generosity, they can appear as patronizing, arrogant, or tokenism. So I think in the context of community, precepts and ethical considerations keep us alert and offer a wider version of reality that includes self-understanding and self-knowledge that then can be extended through compassion to others. Because when we understand ourselves and our own conflicted thinking and emotions, then we can extend that understanding to everyone else. And the precepts kind of wear down our selfishness and our self-protectiveness so that we can get as close as possible to wisdom. In our daily confrontation with our likes and dislikes and ideologies and ambiguities and resentment and forgiveness and our saints and our evildoers, I think there's always this option and opportunity for reflection and contemplation. And part of that includes a willingness to experience ruefulness and sometimes even laugh at ourselves and our ideologies without forsaking ourselves or them. So we take a narrow view and then an open view again and again. There's really only one person we can change, and that's not egotistical or ineffective. In Buddhist teaching, it's stated as, no one can purify another. So the path of character development and self-knowledge often works most deeply through moments or experiences of failure, misunderstanding, loneliness, or those searing positive and negative emotions that are based in desire and hatred. So these, they don't need to be avoided. They're actually signals to us of defensiveness and fear and so on and so forth. So they can be really deep moments for this sort of self-knowledge that becomes character development. And I think in times of where things seem a little bit worse than usual, times of violence and retaliation, which are happening between us daily, as well as in the world, we can resist the temptation to consider ourselves innocent or capable of offering, sort of armchair expertise about who is right and wrong. And at the same time, we have to care and keep all these ambiguities in mind. In Dale Wright's chapter on morality in The Six Perfections, Buddhism and the Cultivation of Character, he points to the ambiguities of the teachings. How the Bodhisattva is to fulfill this paradoxical demand of understanding there is no substantial independent self, and yet the requirement of practicing morality, is difficult to grasp and will be deferred over and over until we arrive at the sixth perfection of wisdom. But that deferral is precisely what bodhisattvas face. They begin their Buddhist practice within the parameters of their original understanding of the world. How could they begin otherwise? I am feeling rather gloomy. Sorry about that. Things, continue to arise that please us or frighten us, hurt, horrify, annoy, affirm us or dismiss us, and that support or threaten us and those around us. And I think we continue, to respond in various skillful and unskillful ways. And when we encounter these experiences in the context of community, our container, I think navigating them is enriched and made more complex the more diverse the community is able to be. So the reminders always reminding us that community is small and wide, close and very dispersed. So the Buddhist recommendation is contradictory, and it's filled with distress and celebration. Applying Buddhist ethics and then engaging in contemplation and reflection, and sustaining this kind of radical hope in the possibility of something like peace or patience or a combination of everything and generosity for ourselves and others. And knowing that this hope is unlikely to be met, we might despair and even avoid making the effort required to work towards it. And just to say things and not do things that are evidence of our intention. And yet, you know, we have everything we need to bring this hope to fulfillment. And part of that is through not just stating intentions, but following through, see what happens, let them unfold, and, you know, accept the experimentation and the risk and the humility that is required. So thank you very much, and I know there's going to be time for questions and comments. Did you want to explain, Kevin, how that works?
If you have a question. Is this mic working? There we go. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone over.
And the online people can also ask questions.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. That was, I don't know, I'm really sparked just in terms of how to think about all these things. And I think about communication, but in the context of the big community, the human community of all of us. And I've kind of made the choice to make friends in my small community in Sonoma with people that don't agree with me. And I wonder, in terms of communication and in terms of Buddhism, where does conflict and argument and debate, do they have a place in Buddhism? Do they have a place in exchange of ideas? How do we present things humbly but also clearly and without hurting and without causing suffering? I think it's a very, very difficult line to ride. And so where does conflict and argument and debate belong in our practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of it is that risk part, because part of our risk in stating our opinions is that someone will disagree with us. And then we'll have to go through the process. And is it going to be an argument? Is it going to be a matter of, curiosity? But if you put too many strictures on it, then you've kind of killed it. So it's almost like this sense of courage that's not trying to destroy. That's not the intention. But it's also not trying to avoid, the sort of value of our anger, which is to bring out that energy that goes toward wisdom. In Buddhism, anger and wisdom are connected. So but it's like Dale Wright says, you start out unskillful. And so how can we, sort of have that humility to be unskillful and keep going and repair and recognize when repair is not possible and not kill it all just because it's uncomfortable and frightening. So I don't know if that's a really helpful answer, but
I think it's about direction and not necessarily a firm answer. But I'm gay, and I have friends that say, "Oh, everything's fine in the gay community." Yet I see laws, thousands of laws across the country, kind of taking away my rights, and to have that conflict with another person, or that discussion with another person, becomes heated, and I've really tried to step back from it, but I fail. But I think you give me good direction, so thanks.
well, there's a philosopher, and I'm embarrassed because her last name's Cherry. She's a black philosopher, and she has written about anger and the value of anger and about forgiveness and what it really entails. She said it's not always like, oh, now we're friends. Sometimes it's this process, sort of internal process, and it doesn't always look the same for everyone. And I think that's also part of it, is that we have this image out here of what doing it right looks like. And then the process of getting there is just erased. So how do you get to that is part of the sort of richness and value of deciding to not cause harm. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to cause it. I mean, that's why I think the precepts, I've said this over and over, they describe everything we do all the time and tell us not to do it. So, how does that work? Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. So many things. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense is what they were called. I'd love to know more about the context that David Hilliard was talking about, how it is that he would not adhere to nonviolence. But so many things in your talk, as always, of great value. You mentioned Dale Wright, and my memory in the Six Perfections is that he refers to that paradox as the Bodhisattva paradox, that we begin our Buddhist practice based on our own experience, as flawed human beings, and as self-centered human beings, and try to move towards a non-self position, or a position of compassionate humility. And that's incredibly paradoxical to actually live in practice in that place. But I read his book probably 8 years ago, and there seems like there's been very little change in my living within that paradox right there. I don't seem to be that much closer to a place of humble compassion. And I feel like that has actually been my main practice, is to accept living in the Bodhisattva paradox, to try to, because I feel like perfectionism around the precepts really causes a lot of harm. And it's a much more fruitful place to live in that sort of less clear place of the paradox, in between those two places of being self-centered and being in a place of compassion. So thank you very much for bringing that up again and articulating it so wonderfully.
Well, one of the things, again, it's like we project forward what it would be like if we were enlightened, or a peaceful being or compassionate, and forget that all that has to happen in the meantime for us to have that realization. And I think that's why Zen in particular sort of emphasizes failure. It's like, it's not like the effort towards perfection is inappropriate, but it's realizing how hard it is that actually kind of breaks us down. And of course, you end up noticing, well, if I made all these commitments to the precepts and enlightenment in the bodhisattva way, and I'm still making mistakes, well, who am I to judge the world? Not that you should not have opinions about it, and but it starts that. I think that's the breakdown, and there's a lot of frustration in there, and sorrow, and joy, because then you join the world in a different way, I think. Does that make sense?
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you.
I'll go. As a vegan animal rights activist, I just wanted to address the pet food industry.
Yeah.
There is no easy answer. There is a very large vegan pet food industry that doesn't use animal products in their food, mostly geared towards dogs. Dogs are omnivores and can eat anything. Cats are naturally carnivores and have a more difficult time with a non-animal-based diet. So I also have a lot of friends who actually cook all their food for their pets too, and make it very rich with beans and rice and et cetera to sustain their pets' needs. So there are alternatives. It's not always easy. It's we do the best we can, and we may not always be perfect, but as I said, we do the best we can to help our pets and try to minimize suffering.
Well, I think what's interesting underneath it for me, though, is that the pets in the first place, like, are they about our needs, or what? Like, what is our relationship to those animals that we have this need for all this processing of food and the packaging of it and the, fussy cat label and that sort of thing? So that's, I think, part of the question for me. And it's not a judgment, I'm just watching, my cognitive dissonance, and then how moments where I find it's kind of sparked or something, I'm like, wait a second. And I'm working with it, just I think in the same way you are, like, how does this work? What does this mean? Apparently, I heard that the pet food industry has the more negative impact on the environment than human beings and cars and owning your own home.
Yeah, that's probably true.
So what do we do, But we want this pet, this animal, and this relationship, and then, anyway, not just what's happening and how do we divide our thinking in that and other instances, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So along the lines of the anger response,
Could you hold the microphone? I can't quite.
Yeah, one along the lines of the anger response that we've been talking about. One thing that stuck out from your talk was about, when we see or hear some injustice, we often have the armchair expertise, I think you put it, And so I feel like what's different about these times is that we have access to all these raw images of injustice and violence that we wouldn't normally have had, before. And so it seems like when I see some of that stuff, in order to not be overwhelmed by anger, I do kind of say why it's wrong or analyze it, out loud or something. as a way to not be overwhelmed by anger. So what would be a more maybe skillful way of dealing with anger when you see some of this stuff, do you think?
I don't think that anger is inappropriate. And underneath it is fear and sorrow. So I think maybe accessing some of those. And what is that word? That you have no agency? Helplessness? You know, that's part of the anger too. You can't do anything about it. And one other part of that, which is sort of preachy, is to pay attention to how you treat other people and that sort of thing, and how our daily interactions are examples that grow into these situations that are so terrifying.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk. Earlier, I believe you made the comment that nonviolence didn't really work or doesn't really work. If you could maybe comment on that, because from my observations, it did work. It did make differences. It was very instrumental in changing minds and hearts, especially during the during the earlier civil rights movement, what Martin Luther King was and others were teaching, did a lot. So, but like I said, I believe you made the comment that nonviolence doesn't really work. I mean, and even just looking at using it on a day-to-day basis, approaching people. Actually, could you just comment more on that and why you said that?
Well, I hesitated to say it because it has had an impact. And I would say, yes, nonviolence has an impact, and huge changes, daily changes. But it doesn't solve it. It's not like that's the end. We get to this place and then it's over. In the same way, can be this idea that violence will end things. And, nonviolence will end this. And in a way, it's so close to violence in this kind of funny little way, because we want things to be different, which they should be, and they shift, but it keeps rising to the surface again. And that's historical. It's not just in our current circumstances. They keep, we have these wars everywhere in places where, what was it needed for? What was the necessity? You can't figure it out, What's the point? What's the, what's the violence trying to solve, and what is the nonviolence trying to prevent? So I think there's this kind of horrible ambiguity in all of it, but I think nonviolence is the most hopeful. And I think I said that as well. I don't think violence does bring things to the surface, and it was quite a conflict for me in terms of feminist thinking. Was violence sometimes necessary? I had to ask myself that. And I don't know the answer, but I understand that sense of necessity in order to say something. And that's why I was thinking about the Black Panthers. Why aren't they also heroes for us? Because they were trying to address it in that way, which was also effective, but it's so terrifying. and destructive in terms of relationships and what do you call it, building, some sort of understanding. And yet, that also had a huge impact on, and other violent responses bring things to our mind, to our consciousness, that, oh, we haven't solved this. How interesting. It's still happening. So like, how do they talk to each other? But I do believe and hope that nonviolence is the more effective, the more hopeful. And I'm not sure if that was what you were asking, but.
Yeah, I just wanted you to comment on that. Yeah. I mean, I see nonviolence as a process and as a way of being, rather. Because like the Bodhisattva vows, I don't see it as an expectation that it's going to solve or end or cure. Because nothing will. Things will continue as they continue. But I see it as a process and as a way of thinking and being and relating to the world and relating to others that, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Yes, thank you.
We have an online question. Their Zoom hand went down,
Okay.
I've been told. So we have a question from Burke.
Yeah, I do have a question. I was actually asking you the same question. You
Uh-huh.
brought it up.
Mm-hmm.
But I was struggling a little bit as you were talking about the nonviolence approach and how it hasn't really worked perfectly. Because, I come from a country where I was a conscientious objector.
Mm-hmm.
So I have taken a nonviolent stance on the issue of military service. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to immigrate here, just among many other reasons, because of the treatment of people who take a nonviolent approach when it comes to certain political issues. And I was also, is it too loud? I was also sort of vacillating back and forth, thinking, okay, it makes sense a little bit that we can't always fix things with a nonviolent approach, or we may not be able to have a concrete result. But at the end of the day, is the yearning for peace in a nonviolent way, I feel like it fuels the bodhicitta, the feeling. I feel like it's the extension of the vows, even though we may not. Sometimes I think people are overly obsessed with the concrete results, and we don't acknowledge that the impact can be not tangible or conceivable to us, but still it has a ripple effect in a way that we are unable to see it. So that's, I was just,
I agree.
yeah.
Well, this is our sort of ambiguous situation of we're working on the vows and sort of trying to come to some sort of settlement about ourselves and our relationship to the world and how we help and hinder and all of those things. But that process itself is truly making a difference, yes. And it's effective, even though it can seem to be egotistical. It's actually effective. And our hesitation sometimes to do things, that are just seem urgent to us. And that hesitation and giving it a little space, huge difference. But yes, you don't notice it so much. But I think that one of the biggest hindrances is having this goal in front of us, how things are going to be when everything is the way I want it, or when everything is fine, and having that there kind of hinders a lot of the actual workings. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the way I like to relate to nonviolence is, instead of seeing it as perfectionism, I see it as an appropriate response.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to, relate to it from a more humble place. It may not be, get to help us fix things completely, but it brings internal peace to me personally, which in turn I feel like affects the whole world.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm already over this side, so I'll come over here and then we'll get the cards. There you go.
Thank you, Wendy, for bringing up the real sort of uncertainty of resolving all those things. I have a question about something I've been thinking about a lot. For phraseology, I call it dominance culture. And when you were talking about why people have pets, even I would say, why do people have children? Sometimes, why do they have spouses? And how separate is that love and self-fulfillment and mutual fulfillment from a certain part of humans, I think, which is to dominate. And can you understand what I'm saying when I say dominance culture, in the sense of it applies to everybody, moment on moment, and it's something that we, as beginning bodhisattvas, I think, we come in from dominance culture and say, I'm going to do something different. Does any of that strike a bit of wisdom that you can deliver?
Well, I wonder if what you're sort of referring to is this idea of having control over getting things we want and avoiding things we don't want. So in a sense, I think that's, if you have a sense of dominance, you're going to want things to be a certain way that will be pleasing to you and won't upset your kind of peace of mind and your sense of yourself as a good person or your sense of yourself as whatever. So I think it has something to do with that. Is that what you're...
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is that I've felt in my own personal life a strong sense of being dominated by others. And as I look around the world and watch my experience and my expression, I find that I'm re-expressing with the alphabet I learned. And I don't think that it's restricted just to because I'm a white guy, or an old white guy for that matter, but that it is something that is, when you brought up pets, I was thinking, well, some people really dominate their pets and they abuse their pets and they treat them like chattel, as well as people who with their various other relationships. And so when I'm parsing out this thing, it's not racism to me, it's dominance culture. It's not sexism to me, it's dominance culture. Not pet abuse, it's dominance culture. But I wonder if that's a helpful way of thinking about it. Maybe I'm
Well, I
off
think
the
it's
track.
very useful. You look at it, you sort of reflect. There's this author who wrote about codependence named Charles Whitfield. And for some reason, out of all that literature, I find his the most helpful. And he addresses, this sense of control, this sense of, dominance that you felt and then you put on to others as something learned. But his eventually, what happened to me in reading him was I understood him as expressing love. And so I think that's the little piece of all of this that sort of keeps coming around, is where does our warm humanity come back to us? Where do we get access to that again? When all these horrible things are happening, we've experienced terrible things or whatever, and so how does that come back? How do we find that again and share it and, what do you call it? Not share it in a, like, oh, now I know the right way, but, you know, let it soften us to the world. Not needing to be right, not needing to have this projection actually be here now in order for me to still move in that direction and have aspirations for that kind of understanding. So it's this, I'm not sure if I'm, yeah.
I would say it's a difficult thing to talk about, and the idea that dominance is something versus racism is something different is hard to grok too. So,
well,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I hope you all feel free to move around. We've been sitting for a while.
Thank you, Wendy. I was also really struck by your kind of analysis of nonviolence and violence and their merits, both of their merits and both of their weaknesses. And one of the things I was kind of turning when you were talking about that was just kind of the non-dual nature between them. And one thing I thought of was, maybe I was just wondering what you thought too, is I think they're both valuable in the sense that maybe perhaps it can fuel kind of right action and right speech and this agency to do something and to watch either my passive side, which is kind of, oh, I don't want to say anything, I'm scared, or it's someone else's job, or the aggressive part, which is, I'm going to get them, or like, I need to be right, or they need to change, or whatever that is, to find like that, like you said, that wisdom within myself that is neither, in a sense, but it's just somewhere in the middle of like finding that first understanding within myself how my own actions can, like you said, ripple, like as Berk said, is like my hate is the world's hate. Like I contribute to that hate if I'm hating, or if I'm trying to get away from something, it's all in that mix. And if I can find that middle place within myself, that appropriate response to, you know, that courage to say the thing or to do something different or to not do the thing, it comes, and then it comes through in this kind of more kind of middle pathway that is neither, but the value of both is still necessary for me to find that middle place. What do you think about that?
Well, it almost sounds like sort of a little related to what Heiko was talking about too. It's, you know, you call it the middle path because it's between some things. You know, so those things are also true, just as you're saying. I think perhaps in terms of my understanding of Buddhism, a lot of it is about awareness and mindfulness. So mindfulness is about you just keep remembering what happened the last time when I did that. What do I want to happen? And just reminding oneself again and again, oh, so what shall I do this time? And that process changes how we, you know, express ourselves and respond. I mean, Buddhism is, it seems like there's this thing you're going to do, and then a couple years later, everything's going to be fine. But you never end this sort of shifting, this kind of alchemy, but not magic in the sense of being false. It's this shifting, this changing. It even feels like some of it is physical. You know, all those theories of you hold things in your body and that sort of thing. Well, they start to shift. So it's a lot of work, and it's really fun, which I think we often forget. There's something so much vitality in it. The actual conundrum gives us vitality. the actual working with these issues and this ambiguity is energizing. It makes things alive that otherwise we're just kind of, well, that's the way the world is, and you know. And sometimes you do have to rest, but I think it actually is fun in some lively, deep way, even when it's awful.
Would you say then it's also necessary in order to like become liberated or enlightened? Like this horrible violence, this horrible hate, all these things that we have, like we don't want it, we don't like it, yet we need it in order to kind of transform internally.
Yeah. Our desire transforms into generosity. Our anger transforms into wisdom. And then it goes back to anger. And then it goes back to, you know, desire and greed and all those things. But then slowly these things mature and develop. And quickly sometimes too. That sort of flash of realizing something. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm not sure, do we have...
We are out of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.